Here we go. So I guess I'm the last talk between you and the evening program. And as you see, it's only me. As Florian got sick, I left him in Frankfurt to not bring his, his cold into this room. Yeah, I'm very happy to share our experiences about building a multi-cloud or implementing a multi-cloud platform strategy for the European ecosystem. And when, well, talking about multi-cloud, I always have to smile a bit because we started our company in 2017, and back then every talk at every cloud conference was about multi-cloud, but it was mostly talking about multi-cloud, not so much implementing multi-cloud. So I'm super happy that we actually have reached the phase where organizations, well, think about or implement multi-cloud strategies even more, and not only multi-cloud strategies, but also sovereign multi-cloud strategies. And yeah, I'm Christina. I'm one of the co-founders of meshcloud. meshcloud is a Frankfurt-based platform engineering company. We help our customers to build internal platforms, and we treat platforms as a product. And cloud sovereignty is a topic that is very important to us because we believe, and that's basically the first question, right? Why do we even need so many clouds? We believe that having the freedom of choice is what gives you sovereignty. So actually giving you the choice of which clouds do you want to use is a big driver in digital sovereignty. And that's why we've built our product, which integrates a lot of different cloud platforms and provides a unified control plane for those. How did that start? Well, we started in 2017 integrating all, or the biggest back then, open source cloud technologies, OpenStack, Cloud Foundry, OpenShift. Back then, sovereignty was already a very big topic. After that, a lot of enterprise organizations actually started working with the hyperscalers. And in order to support these organizations and in order to give them the freedom of choice, we also integrated the hyperscalers into our platform. And then something interesting happened. If we look at the last, let's say, 2 years, there was actually an explosion in platform integrations, and there were different drivers for that, right? One of them is definitely the sovereign clouds, and I think one of the drivers for those is also, well, first of all, the Trump election last year, but also the public sector moving into the cloud and actually implementing their multi-cloud strategies. And yeah, we heard it in the morning. Public sector should use those clouds. We need customers on those clouds to make them great, to make them big, and to make them successful. So having that driver is something that I believe is very good. Then, of course, there are some other providers and use cases that aren't very sovereign, like the Chinese ones. And then there's other platforms that are just in use because a multi-platform strategy has arisen. A lot of organizations go into multi-platform, not only integrating multiple providers, but also offering multiple platforms within their internal IT services. And yeah, my talk is not only about multi-cloud, but also about multi-platform. So as the term platform is kind of used in very different ways and interpretations, I brought one that I quite like, and as we are in Germany, I think that fits nicely to our imagination as well. It comes from the platform strategy book of Gregor Hopi. And he actually compares platforms, or he derives platforms from the car manufacturing industry, where you would have the platform on the bottom, which is the part that takes a lot of investment, but which is also highly standardized and not very differentiated. And then on top of that, you put the head, which requires a lower investment, but this enabled the car manufacturing companies to actually produce many more models than they could before, because they had that platform strategy and they could use the economies of speed in the top part, where they could just offer a lot of different models, and the economies of scale in the bottom part. Now, if we want to translate that into cloud, of course, the interesting question is, where is that cut? Like, where do we stop being the platform, and where do people start building stuff on top of that? And that's a very good question, and there is not really an easy answer. Of course, from the cloud provider to the customer, the answer is easy because there is a shared responsibility model. It's clear what the cloud provider is responsible for, and it's clear what the customer is responsible for. But if you're building internal platforms, you have that situation internally, right? So you have an internal IT team or an internal cloud team that is offering a service to the developers, and you have to decide on which layer do I want to abstract. And there are different options for that. I've brought two. One of them being like the magic button where the developer doesn't even know where they're deploying their application. This is often used with Kubernetes applications, for example, where it doesn't really matter which cloud is behind that in the end. I don't need to know. I just, run the app and it works. At least that's the dream of a lot of people. And then there's the other way, which is actually, if I have a lot of different cars, why not use the different cars for different use cases? And the same is true for clouds, right? The reality in enterprises is often that I have a very heterogeneous landscape of applications, and not all applications are the same, and not all applications have the same requirements. So actually having a mix of cloud providers and of platforms offered internally helps me to address and to cover a large variety of use cases. And the use cases can be different, but also the skill levels of the developers can be different. So there are some people that will be happy with a bare-bone cloud account, but there are other people that actually don't know how to use this. And then there's regulatory requirements where some applications may be able to run in a public cloud in a hyperscalers and other applications are not. So actually being able to provide that mix is something that gives you a lot of power and a lot of control on your infrastructure. Now, if we want to implement such a strategy, we of course have to take a decision. And which of the platforms or which of these basically models do we want to use? That really depends on the internal customers that we are serving. If you're an internal platform team, this is something that you should really think about. Who are your users? What are their skills? What are their capabilities? And what are their use cases? Because usually they're not the same as yours. So understanding how do people interact with the cloud platforms and the providers that I am providing as a cloud team is really critical. You should have something like an ideal customer profile where you know what kind of user is going to be interacting with your cloud technologies provided internally. And as I cannot look into all of your heads, I brought a model which is quite common in a lot of enterprise organizations, but of course it's not right for everyone. So this can be adapted or it can even be wrong for some of you. But it's a pretty common use case that we see out there. And that's a multi-platform setup where you have a foundation platform in the bottom, which gives you like the pretty rough infrastructure, the bare-bone accounts and so on. And then you can build specified platforms on top of that for specific use cases and for specific groups of users. So these can be data platforms, AI platforms, business platforms, or now very much talked about developer platforms. We look at two of those in a quick run through. What is a foundation platform? I brought a model here which is called the Cloud Foundation Maturity Model. You also find that on that website. And this actually groups capabilities into different pillars. And these are capabilities that are cloud agnostic, but that are quite important if you want to build an internal platform. And they're grouped into the tenant management, the IAM, the compliance, and the cost management pillar, because we believe that all of those need to be integrated with each other to actually make for a pleasant experience for a user, right? You need a tenant, so you need a cloud environment, you need access to it, you need to follow certain compliance requirements, and if you don't have your cost under control, you also have a problem. So actually solving all of that in one go is quite helpful and then also a good experience for the user. The alternative is that the user has to run to different departments, get the different parts of that, and that doesn't feel very smooth and convenient. Now, what I want to share is how we implemented that for some of the sovereign cloud platform. So we will look into some of these capabilities. And yeah, for these three providers here. And the tenant provisioning is basically really about providing a bare-bone account in each of those providers. And we used open source tooling in order to implement that. All these modules and building blocks that I'm talking about now, they're also on a website called hub.meshcloud.io. So they're accessible and they can be used. Well, the tenant provisioning process is really just the creation of the project. We use the Terraform providers of the cloud providers for that. And then, of course, you need not only the environment itself, but also access to it. In terms of role model, what we usually see and what we usually recommend is to have certain standard roles that you can then map into the individual providers. So let's say you have a user, reader, contributor role, and then you kind of define that within the provider and you provide access to that roles and based on that roles. This is an individual building block that can be added on top of the tenant in order, well, to get access to the corresponding project. What is great is that by now all of them have an SSO integration, so that's also possible to achieve. And in terms of cost, we built a little application that is collecting the costs on a daily basis and basically brings them into a common format so that you can have one invoice in the end for all the different cloud providers. If people are using different clouds, you want to have a unified system for this. And yeah, that's something that we build on top of that in order to make those providers easier to manage and to leverage them within the enterprise context. What do we get? Sorry. So basically, we covered the ones with the green tick. If we look at the sovereign providers, one thing we see is that, for example, the resource hierarchy, so how you can actually organize those accounts within those providers is much less than in the hyperscalers, but you can basically work around that. Also, there are some things, some gaps within the APIs, so it's not exactly the same, but you can still build a foundation platform that gives you a solid basis for leveraging those providers and providing infrastructure to your teams. How does that look like? Basically, this is how people can request that. So we have a marketplace, we have an AI interface, but of course you can also just provide the modules in a repository. The important part is what developers get is a bare-bone account with a basic governance, and they need to set up all the infrastructure themselves. So they are responsible for that infrastructure, and for some, this is great because they can do whatever they want, and they are free in choosing the services that they need. And for others, this is too hard because they actually don't know how to do that and how to set up their application. So for those, developer platforms might be the right way to go. And they are actually a move up the stack, and this is an exemplary best practice architecture that you can follow to provide such a developer platform. It consists of individual building blocks, and mostly we have like a Git repository, then different namespaces based on Kubernetes, and then CI/CD pipelines, all of that integrated, so you don't have to set up the infrastructure yourself anymore, but you have a so-called composed golden path that brings all of that out of the box, and as a developer you can just start building your application. And of course, the nice thing is that you can leverage the modules that are provided to open source. You can also exchange the providers that are underneath, so you're flexible and like plug and playing different modules and templates as you need and as your organization needs. What would that look like? Well, again, you're not looking for a specific provider anymore, but you're saying, okay, I want to build a Kubernetes application. How do I do that? And your interface is basically a Git repository. So you interact with the code directly. You even get an application blueprint, and you just change the code, and then the deployment happens automatically. And that's a much higher level. You need to care less about the infrastructure that is underneath. This is being set up for you. You have the tool chain to follow best practices in development, and you, well, hopefully have less cognitive load as a developer to build your application and focus on doing that. Yeah, and with that, I'm coming to the last slide. You have to choose the right abstraction layer for your users. These solutions are not right for everyone, but you need to think about who are they and what do they need. Having a unified control plane for these different clouds is critical, and basically designing for that multi-platform reality is the way forward, bringing all the different players and technologies together for a stronger European ecosystem. And I think that's it.